She thumps a cane and drinks champagne. She's formidable and judgmental, but we can guarantee that she's a quintessential lady D, but recognizes great potential. What would Danbury do?
Welcome to What Would Danbury Do, a podcast about the Bridgerton series from A to V. If you're anything like us, watching that dueling scene had you mentally checking off the 10 Duel Commandments. But how accurate is it? And when it comes to affairs of honour, what's really at stake? Writer and philosopher Damon Young met Kate at dawn to talk pistols, swords, honour and the patriarchy. Don't forget you can find us on Twitter and Facebook as @BridgertonPod and Instagram as WWDDPod. And join the conversation using the hashtag WWDDPod.
Dueling is a very marginal part of life. There were supposedly 10,000 duels fought in France over a sort of 100-year period or 150-year period. I forget the figures. But we're still talking about a tiny percentage of the population for a tiny period of history. And there have always been trials by combat and duels of a sort, but they're not central a lot of the time. They are the exception, not the rule. And yet they hold an enormous place in popular culture. And the same can be said of swords. And this is something I want to write about. One of my side projects is a book on swords. And it's the idea that swords, like duels, are a peripheral matter. And yet we love them. We find them exciting and immensely symbolic. And even in the period where people had duels and used swords, they thought they were cool. Even though they were on one side, horrible blood-soaked weapons of cruelty, and on the other side, actually quite inefficient. If you want to win a war, a lot of in many of these periods, you don't use swords, you use spears and bows and cavalry and really good tactics, and your environment. A sword's a backup weapon a lot of the time. But they have this enormously central role in popular culture. From comics, video games, movies, TV, it's always a sword. And we just go, yeah, of course there's a sword. Of course Luke Skywalker, like Space Samurai, has a sword. What else would he have? A grappling hook. And the same is true of duels. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader fight a duel. And we're like, yeah, of course they do. Of course they fight a duel. Why would they fight a duel? This could have been handled in so many other ways, but they fight a duel. There are duels in Harry Potter. We need to teach the children. We'll get them dueling with death sticks. My name is Damon. I'm a philosopher and author. I have written 13 books, which range from philosophy books, like The Art of Reading or Philosophy in the Garden or How to Think About Exercise, to children's books like My Nana is a Ninja or My Dad is a Dragon. My most recent book is on getting off sex and philosophy.
I'd like to start this discussion looking at this concept of honor. The whole episode of episode 4 is called An Affair of Honor, and honor plays, I think, a really significant role throughout the whole course of the lives of the characters. It's a consideration that comes into each of their lives in one way or another. Can you tell me, what is honor?
The important thing about honor, especially in the context of Bridgerton, is it's not a quality that just attaches to you as an individual. To be an honorable man, especially in, say, the late 18th or early 19th centuries, to be an honorable man is to be responsible for the social esteem of your whole family. To fail to be honorable is to sully everyone you're involved with. If someone insults you, your honor is besmirched. You lose your social standing. If someone insults your sister, in some ways you lose even more social standing, because she's not a full person, really, according to society. You're a full person. She's more like a child, and you're responsible for her. Now, it seems a warped system by modern standards, and as an aside, I would say it is, but we need this to make sense of what's going on in stories like those of Bridgerton.
So obviously the honor that is discussed in this episode is incredibly codified. Has it looked like that throughout history, or is the Regency idea of honor quite specific to that time period?
Okay, so especially in notions of duels, we used to have something called trial by combat, right? So the idea was if someone stole from you, or someone attacked you, or there was some kind of crime, especially without witnesses, the idea is you could go to a judge or the authorities and say, we need to sort this out. I challenge this person to combat. Now, that was eventually outlawed in, I think, the 16th century. And the only people who were allowed to duel then and encouraged to duel were the aristocracy, because the aristocracy didn't have to go to a judge. The aristocracy were carried their own standards and their own honor. So this is important. When we're talking about the men of Bridgerton, we're talking about aristocrats for whom the notion of honor is central to their existence. Okay, so if you were a merchant, maybe you could buy a little bit of esteem, but you wouldn't have honor in the same way as a duke. If you are the sister of a duke or the sister of a lord, you have your honor. You can lose that by sleeping around, for example. But really, the person in charge of your honor is your father. By this time, say in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, this notion of honor was central to the idea of being an aristocrat, of being the elite of society. You weren't supposed to work. You didn't have a job. You didn't have a trade. What did you have? You had your honor, that is to say, your family standing. To lose that was to lose yourself, in a sense.
A lot of times women didn't have any opportunities whatsoever to either control the circumstances in which they might lose their honor and or defend themselves against it should that honor be taken away from them. Yep. And I think it's important in this discussion, particularly around what happens with Simon and Daphne, in that, you know, Daphne was a willing participant in this particular case with Simon, but nonetheless, she loses her honor. But in many cases, women could lose their honor without even potentially being in the same room.
What we're essentially talking about is the idea that women don't have agency in the same way. Their choices are not only more circumscribed, but often they're not considered to have a choice at all. And in many cases, it wouldn't matter if a woman had consented or not to being alone with a strange man at night, let alone being touched, let alone being kissed, let alone it going further. What mattered was her honor, and her honor was at stake regardless of her wishes. And then it was not her role to defend her honor. It was her brother's role or her father's role, some male head of the household. So what you find are women bearing the consequences of this system of honor, but having very few responsibilities or authority positions within it. And again, they are infantilized. They're very important to the process, women. You know, the men need these women to carry their name and give them status and give them children and possibly give them a little bit of happiness, but that's neither here nor there. But the women are peripheral, men are the center.
I like that you're talking about honor in a sense of it being both classist and gendered, which I think is something that we see played out we definitely see the gendered issue of honor being played out in Bridgerton between the way that women comport themselves versus the way that men comport themselves, and the way that the women manage their honor in a different way and manage their responsibilities in a different way from the way that the men choose to manage their responsibilities and their honor. And it's something that we spoke about in one of the earlier episodes around the way that the women weaponized gossip as a way of protecting themselves and protecting their daughters, whereas men, of course, have, I want to say more flamboyant, but I suppose it's a more external way of protecting their honor. They have more options available to them. Again, like I said, it's a little bit more codified for how they can protect their honor. You say that women were only provided their honor via the men in their family. Has that always been the case? Have women always sort of just been tied into the family honor? Or are they able to carry honor by themselves?
Again, it depends on class. So aristocratic or wealthy women have always had more opportunity to carry their own esteem than their poorer or lower status peers, peers for want of a better word. But in general, in any patriarchal culture, and most of European history has been patriarchal, in any patriarchal culture, it will be the men who are the full human beings in the family and the state, and it will be women who are there to service the men in one way or another, either servicing them viscerally by fulfilling their needs, doing the lowest work, constantly producing nothing, leaving nothing behind, or serving them by giving them children, or serving them by being a beautiful ornament or whatever. And so you can see why the female notion of honor is when they undo those very particular roles. So if you sleep around, you no longer belong to a man, you're no longer controllable, you're having pleasure that is your own, that is no longer attendant to your role as a provider of babies or an ornament, and so on. So part of this is also that women didn't have a public life in the same way. They had a private life. That's why gossip was something they could use to perhaps raise their status and diminish someone else's. But they didn't have a public life. Most of these women couldn't fight a duel. They couldn't hold a political position. They couldn't work, especially if they're of a higher class. So there are only a few ways they can preserve their honor, as opposed to this idea that you can swagger around issuing challenges or fighting in battles.
It's as if women come imbued with a kind of honor that they can never build on, they can only lose. Whereas men come imbued with honor that they can, in fact, increase, but it's actually a lot harder for them to lose their honor.
Yeah, I think it's Simone de Beauvoir talked about something like this. It's that men have projects. They're externally focused. They make their mark on the world. They shape the world. They compete with one another to enhance and enrich the world. Women are there as sort of auxiliaries in this process. They don't have their own projects. They serve the men's projects by not losing their honor. They serve men's projects by retaining their honor so they can solidify associations between families, for example, or grease the wheels of trade, or just provide heirs. They don't have a sort of autonomous existence of their own. And it's no coincidence that women started to gain more independence, more autonomy, more freedom at the same time as duels began to wane, because at the heart of the duel is the idea that you don't carry the honor of your family. Your honor shrinks and becomes a purely individual affair. And at the same time, we start to see women considered in their own right rather than just as an appendage to men.
I want to go back to this concept of class, because there's almost a progression, I think, from lower class up through upper class, where you start almost from this idea of respectability that then morphs into honor the higher up that you get as a currency within the society. I suppose middle classes didn't really exist at the time, but what would sort of that respectable middle class look like at the time of Bridgerton?
I mean, you do definitely have a middle class at that time, from the lowest middle class, the shopkeeper, to a merchant who might be very wealthy, but they're still not a member of the aristocracy. They're not landed, they're not titled, they're just rich. And a noble would be within their rights to refuse a duel from a rich man because they're not their peers, they're not their equal, they don't deserve to be considered even worthy of a duel. So a noble might pay their henchmen to beat up a merchant, but they wouldn't fight a duel against them.
Can you tell us what a duel actually entails?
Sometimes it was to first blood, which is a lot easier with a sword. And so the introduction of pistols and the popularity of pistols in some ways raised the stakes of dueling because you can't control what happens to the bullet once it's shot.
Can you explain what first blood means?
So first blood means essentially you scratch someone, you cut someone, you draw a significant amount of blood. Mm-hmm. That's the end of the duel. And the idea of first blood is really important because it demonstrates that the duel is actually not about killing anyone. It's not even about winning. The purpose of the duel is to demonstrate that you have the courage and perseverance to turn up. It's really not trial by combat because you're not considered to regain your honor or lose your honor depending on whether you win or lose. And so if you're able to cut your opponent or they're able to cut you, you're done. Now, again, plenty of people died, but plenty of people lost an eye or lost the use of their hand or whatever it was. This is not about two chaps trying to kill each other most of the time. This is about two chaps trying to preserve their standing and their family standing in society by demonstrating typical chivalric virtues like courage and perseverance.
I want to talk about weapons a little bit more. Were there just those two options for dueling weapons, the sword and the pistol? I mean, could you just have the option of just punching each other?
As far as I know, for most of the sort of 300-year history of dueling, your two options were swords, or perhaps sword and dagger, or sword and buckler. A buckler is a small shield. And then later on, pistols. Pistols really did not become popular until the end of the 18th century, 1770, 1780. Until then, it would be a sword. And there were a whole variety of swords that might be used, from a rapier in the 16th and 17th century to a small sword in the 18th century, which is like a rapier but lighter.
Can you tell us what those swords might look like?
So a rapier has a very fancy curling handguard a lot of the time, and it's a very long, thin blade.
Is it like you would see in the Three Musketeers?
Often, yes, but it's complicated because they would often use small swords in those movies because the people who choreographed it did modern fencing and knew nothing about historical fencing. So my rapier is about 144 centimeters long, I think, like 1.5 meters roughly. Rapiers are very long and they're cut and thrust. You can chop with a rapier, you can thrust with a rapier, but they're especially good at thrusting. A small sword is a thrust-only weapon. You can't chop with, you can't hack at it. It's for puncturing. And so that's the kind of sword that often looks very dainty when people are fencing with it. But think of it as an extremely long stiletto knife, and suddenly it doesn't seem so fancy.
Right. So we moved from rapiers and short swords. Were those sort of the designated dueling weapons for the vast majority of our dueling history? Yeah.
So in places like Spain and Italy, the rapier was especially popular. They were used in England, but Italy and Spain were known for their rapier use. England liked the broadsword. Scotland liked the broadsword, but I don't know how many duels were fought with those because they were military weapons, not civilian weapons. Whereas the rapier was often...
And those were the great big heavy swords, the ones that you would often see, like the hacking.
No, broadsword is
Tell me no.
A broadsword is
Fiction is lied to me.
A broadsword is a single-handed cut and thrust sword. It's just a typical sword, but it has a basket guard over the hand. And they were quite popular in England in the 16th and 17th centuries, and Scotland in the same period and a bit later. So Highlanders would often carry a broadsword, a basket-hilted broadsword.
I'll do my best to find pictures to put in the show notes.
Sure. And often if you had a rapier, you would also duel with a dagger. So you would have a left-hand dagger, and the idea is you can use that dagger to parry the opponent's blade, but also to stab if you got in close enough.
Now, there's the throwaway line in Bridgerton where the doctor says you can't control a bullet unless you're one of the king's best marksmen. How accurate were the pistols?
So pistols in that period were notably inaccurate. They weren't rifled, which means that there was no spin imparted on the bullet as it exited the barrel, which meant it was far more likely to go wonky when it fired. Rifling did exist, but it wasn't a common feature of pistols. In fact, it wasn't a common feature of muskets either. So they had a very limited range in these pistols. And in movies, when you see someone shooting their pistol at someone like 100 meters away on a cliff, it's just not going to happen.
Damon, you're just destroying so many hopes and dreams right now.
So
we're never going to believe anything ever again.
Pistols really were a backup weapon for close range. In movies where you see someone boarding a ship and they're in the middle of a fight with their swords and they pull out a single fire pistol and shoot their enemy at a few feet range, that's realistic. They're certainly accurate enough to shoot at a few paces. And someone who was trained to use a pistol would know how to compensate for its inaccuracy. But in general, they were a very damaging but low precision weapon.
Something that you said earlier on was that the aristocracy didn't necessarily have to show up in front of a judge. So when we say that these duels were illegal, what were the actual consequences of fighting a duel if you happened to be caught?
Just fighting a duel often was not enough to land you in serious trouble. The problem was seriously injuring or killing someone. You kill someone in a duel, you may have to leave the country. Now, you may be able to come back to the country in a few years' time, but you'd need to leave. And it's worth pointing out that, again, alongside this shrinking of honor and the rise of modern individuality and higher autonomy, you also had the development of the police force in this period. The notion of a police force really is a very modern concept. They might have the constabulary or they might have the Bow Street runners, but they're essentially civilians who are deputized to bring someone before a judge or to bear witness. You're dealing with a period where you're not going to have a police search for you in the same way for having a duel. You're not going to have the same police presence on the streets at night. No one's going to call 000 if you're crossing swords at 5 a.m. So things are slightly looser in terms of law and order, but things are much tighter in terms of personal reputation. So the police are not going to follow you across borders. Your reputation will.
So when Anthony says that should he harm Simon, he's going to have to leave the country and Benedict will be head of family in all but name, it's for that reason, because he will have harmed a peer of the realm, not because he was doing something illegal.
Yes, I mean, it's complicated. Sometimes a state would outlaw dueling, but it wasn't really prosecuted and it wasn't really frowned upon because so many people in that period agreed with the same notions of honor. There were absolutely criticisms of duels from peers, from politicians, just from ordinary people. But it was part of the fabric of society, these notions of honor and how to defend them for men and women. So yes, you kill someone, you're in trouble. You kill a peer of the realm, you're in serious trouble, but not necessarily because you've dueled. If they had both shot and he had grazed him, it's unlikely to be a problem. No one tells anyone. It's all hush hush, and that's it.
Looking at the actual duel between Anthony and Simon, we see that during the duel, Simon raises his pistol to the sky, which I think you spoke of earlier, wherein he's maintaining his honor because he showed up, even if he chooses not to shoot at Anthony. Whereas Anthony clearly plans to shoot at Simon. When we look at this historically, is this fictional character development that's telling us about the characters, or is it speaking to dueling conventions?
Yeah, this is quite realistic. Sometimes it was frowned upon to shoot in the air. It was seen as not cowardly because you're not the one in danger then, but it was seen as perhaps not in the spirit of the duel. But again, that depended on which circles you moved in and where you were in the world and at what time. But certainly we do have records of people firing in the air because they had no wish to harm the person they were fighting against. They'd restored their honor by turning up and facing a bullet. At that point, they gained nothing whatsoever by shooting at their opponent. And in this case, their choices show us their characters from a very realistic range of options. It makes sense that Anthony was furious because he was the aggrieved head of the family whose sister's reputation had been besmirched. And Simon has nothing to gain by killing his friend.
What do you think the equivalent in today's society is?
Of honor? I mean, we still have notions of honor. The language still makes sense to us, but it is far more individualized, depending on where you are in the world. There are still places in the world where a woman's honor is owned in a way by the head of her family. But in general, I think we have notions like reputation, public standing, and we tend to massage those notions with publicity. The law, litigation is how these things are fenced now, not with swords.
So demanding satisfaction through lawsuits.
Through the courts, yeah. And once again, in a way, it's less fair because all you had to do to maintain honor in an earlier period was turn up and be taken seriously enough to turn up, of course. But now you need to be able to retain a QC. We also have notions like fame, that you can be famous for being dishonorable, for being a cad, being a rake. It doesn't have the same necessary moral standing, whereas to have honor, it implies a certain moral character. For good or ill, it can be false, it can be fake, it can be deceitful, but its character is moral. Fame is possibly immoral, but certainly amoral.
Yeah, it's interesting because you see a lot of people who are famous held up as role models for no reason other than that they're famous.
It is the same movement in the 19th century that helped to individualize honor, standing, and esteem, and allow the middle classes to gain more status in society. Those same forces have now commodified all kinds of public status, and that those two movements are inseparable. My hunch is it's not about honor, strictly speaking. This is about brand a lot of the time. And brand is a kind of free-floating signifier of your commercial viability. It has no moral status at all. It has nothing to do with how courageous you are, how much perseverance you display, how much duty you offer. It has to do with your marketability. Now, that's slightly different to the conversation about cancel culture, where there's an idea that a certain celebrity, for example, has made a mistake and they're supposed to apologize, and they hire consultants to help them manage this movement from supposed pariah to supposed acceptance and then more marketability. But even listening to myself describe that, it's not about honor. It doesn't have any necessary relationship with with these sort of the supposed virtues of the honourable. It's brand management, it's marketing. Now, that isn't to say that celebrities or people in the public eye can't have honour. Of course they have. It's just that honour has lost its value as a kind of public currency. The thing with duel culture is that it's awful. It's we look back at it and think that's so cool, the idea that these extremely prim gentlemen are willing to stand up in dawn's light and face one another with blades. But men were maiming and killing each other over the most ridiculous slights. And it really does show you some of the worst of masculinity, where, for example, someone made a joke about, I think I'm remembering this rightly, someone made a joke about us all being debtors before God. We all owe God. We are all owe a debt to divinity. And someone taking that as a slight because they were being called someone who didn't pay their debts, someone who couldn't pay their bills. And that led to a duel, and I think at least one of them died. But over nothing. It has no substance whatsoever. So you could still have that sense of horrible, free-floating meaninglessness. It's just a slightly different form of it. And again, it's also bound up in that very extended self where you don't just take responsibility for your own conduct, you have to take responsibility for your mothers and your sisters and your daughters. So yes, perhaps we lose something when we lose a sense of what honor is, but I think it's good that dueling culture is in the past.
Why were the duels always at dawn?
I have no idea. I suppose because areas of the city that were good for dueling were less likely to be populated. It's also a very cool thing to say. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but saying, for example, "Sir, we shall duel at 10:15," doesn't have the same poignancy as "we shall duel at dawn." But yeah, I suspect it has to do with not being observed. You want to be recorded. You want all of society whispering that you and such met at dawn with small swords, but you don't want to be seen while you're doing it, because then the police or the constabulary or the authorities will break it up.
That's all for this bonus episode of What Would Danbury Do? Make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, because we'll be releasing bonus episodes throughout the season. And of course, we'll be back soon with Bridgerton episode 5, The Duke and I. In the meantime, you can find Damon Young on Twitter as @DamonAYoung, or check out his book On Getting Off. Damon also recommended the work of Kelly Gardiner, who has written a novel about Julie d'Aubigny. D'Aubigny? I've definitely mucked this up, and I should have made Kate do this with her French skills. Anyway, Kelly's book, which we will link to in the show notes, is based on the extraordinary true story of a young girl who was taught to fence and fight in 1686 Versailles, and became a fighter, opera singer, adventurer, honestly just an all-round badass. Plus, Kelly and our very own Adele co-host the Unladylike Podcast together. So, she's like family. As always, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook as @BridgertonPod and Instagram @WWDDPod, or send us an email at bridgertonpod@gmail.com. This episode was recorded on the traditional and unceded land of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people, and edited by me, Rudy Bremer, on Gadigal country. Thanks for listening, and remember, WWDD. What Would Danbury Do is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts.